Hi guys, I am Nu-TRix, the synth guy, and today we're talking about the Jupiter 8. Everybody knows about the Jupiter 8 from Roland. Everybody knows the sound of it because it played in so many different albums that mark the history of music that we know what it is. But do you really know what a Jupiter 8 is? I'm going to talk about it today because Roland released in their Roland Cloud within Zenology a new Jupiter 8 model expansion, which gives you the control and the sound of a Jupiter inside Zenology, which is, from in my view, pretty awesome. Now, before we go into detail about all of that, I want to answer those who says that basically every software is not good. You need to have the original. Yeah, that's kind of obvious. If you can get a Jupiter 8 and in good condition and play it, go ahead, man. Just that most people don't have one, and most people cannot have one because there's not enough for everybody, and they cost a fortune today because they're vintage. And on top of that, if you can find one that actually works well, it costs more, and then you need to maintain it. And other people like me will say, well, even if I had one, these are huge. Where do I put it? So technically, I'm not against it. Of course, if you can have the original, go ahead, be happy, play with it. But for most people, to have a Jupiter 8 hardware, well, it would probably be a emulation of a Jupiter 8. And there's been a lot of them throughout the years. There's the JP8000 that Roland released at one point in the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, which is a virtual synthesizer mimicking Jupiter 8 up to a point. And actually, it does a lot of what the Jupiter does. It's not a exact replica, but it does a lot of what the Jupiter is. And it has its own sound because it was made in the 90s with the technology of the 90s. And the Jupiter 8 was done in the 80s with the technology of the 80s. And the Jupiter is a real analog synth. And we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the Jupiter. But if you want to recreate and play a Jupiter sound today on hardware, well, you would have the boutique series of the Jupiter. There's the JP8, if I'm not mistaken. And there's the System 8, which is pretty awesome because it's actually a hardware keyboard that runs a whole bunch of virtual Plugout synth. I'll show you the Plugout from Roland that actually runs in a computer as a plugin. So it's a VST, it's an audio unit, but it can run on the System 8. So if you want hardware, it runs on hardware. For what I understand today, the Plugout algorithm is probably one of the best you can find today. Roland themselves went back to the circuit. They analyzed every part of the circuits, every circuit section of the big unit, and all of them are emulated separately. So it's really good for hardware, for computer. It's okay, but it's demanding. And that's why now there's also Zenology. And Zenology has a different way of analyzing and doing the algorithm. And it means that it's less CPU intensive, but it gets you a really great result. And I'll play sounds back to back to hear the differences. It's pretty close, to be honest. I'll put also in the mix the Arturia Jupe 8 V3, if I'm not mistaken. Also, very good contendant to having a virtual emulation of the Jupiter. So let's actually go back in time and talk about what the Jupiter was. Technically, the Jupiter was a 8-voice polyphonic synthesizer that could be split into two parts on the keyboard, so left and right or upper and lower. And you could have two different sounds, and you have a total of 8 voices. So you could have 4 on one, 4 on the bass, and 4 on the pads, or you could actually have two different sounds, so a bass sound and a brass, for example. And that was really cool. It was released in '81, and MIDI came out in '83. So later on, there was some retrofit MIDI adaptation that people could add it to it, but it was not built for MIDI when it came out. If you look at the far left, you have the volume, the balance between the upper and lower. I was talking about the two sections on the keyboard. You've got the arpeggio control, and just under it, you've got the section about the arpeggio, like range and up and down and rhythm and all that stuff. So arpeggio is one thing. It's actually pretty cool, pretty decent, really nice. You have the LFO. There's one LFO, the rate, the delay time, the waveform, normal stuff. And you have the VCO modulator. So you have what controls the VCO So the pitch, basically, you have an LFO, you have an envelope, and look, they go from 0 to 10. So it go from nothing to maximum, and you can assign it to VCO1, both, or VCO2. So very flexible. Pulse width modulation, again, from 0 to maximum. LFO, it could come from LFO, could be manual, it could be envelope 1. So envelope 1 can also be a modulation source to your pulse width modulation. If you move to a VCO1 and VCO2, you see that they're not exactly the same. VCO1 goes from 16 to 2 in type of range. And keep that in mind, because when we're going to look at the virtual recreation of these, they're not exactly with the same limits. There's a cross modulation where you have a VCO2 modulated VCO1, which is basically some type of FM synthesis type of sound you can get out of that. Really nice, in my view, for getting that aggressive tones, a little bit distortion, a little bit freaky frequencies with the cross modulation. And you've got the sync. So sync would be the VCO2 being synced to VCO1. And if you want to hear just the sync result, you would just want to listen to VCO2. If you want to hear just the cross modulation result, you would listen only to VCO1. So the two have different ways of working. And you have something. Remember that there's only one LFO in this. If you want a second LFO, the VCO2, you could flip the normal to low frequency for the range, and it becomes a second LFO if you want to. So you become lower than, frequency that you hear normally. Get the fine tune, get the waveform, classic stuff. Then you've got filter section. You have two filters. You have I-pass, that is just by itself alone. You just cut the low frequencies, that's it. You've got the VCF control for the low pass filter, which is a cutoff resonance. You get a different slope of -12 or -24, so a 2-pole or 4-pole filter. You have the envelope, it goes from 0 to maximum. You get envelope 1 and envelope 2 as a source. You have LFO, you've got key follow, you've got level, you've got the LFO modulation for the amplitude, and 4 different ways that the LFO can affect it. So 0, 1, 2, 3. So the amount of the LFO if you want. And then you've got the envelope. You've got ADSR for the envelope 1, which is mostly used for modulation. ADSR for envelope 2, which is basically the amplitude. We talked about different hardware. If we want to look at how the software emulates this today, I'm going to open my ZenBeats and I'm going to have the 3 different plugins that I have on my computer, compare one side by side. We'll go by just looking at what they offer synthesis-wise. You'll see that they all have a different twist on how to represent the original into this virtual world, and then we'll listen to them. So you've got the Jupiter 8, okay? That's the Plugout from Roland. I'm going to open the Jupe 8 V3. That's the Arturia. Arturia here. And you have the Zenology one, which is totally different. Doesn't look like the original. We'll finish with them at the this one at the end. But let's go with the Jupiter 8. These graphics are meant to look like the original. I think that's pretty cool when you want to mimic the original, but it's difficult to use on a screen like this. It's very small. Of course, you can go in and say, well, option, I want this to be bigger, and you have a bigger screen. But there's a lot of empty space for nothing, because this is meant to be hardware, And I understand when people say, well, this is kind of an awkward way to use it. This was not meant originally to be a plugin, I think. It was meant to be a plugout. This is what it is. Meaning, if you have the hardware to run this, you make your sound in there, in your sequence, and then you output this, and you save it into your System 8, and then you run with it. You go live on tour with it, and you don't need your computer, and it's in your synthesizer. So there's this reason of how it works that is not exactly to be a plugin. So the graphic, in my case, like the keyboard is a loss of space. I don't need it. I don't need to click here to play it. It's not really useful in my view. So you have different controls here in the options, like to have a different zoom, the amount of voices. If you only need 2 voices because you play a bass, then you can go to 2. It'll take less CPU, and there's also optimized for lower CPU usage. So if sometimes you're running too many of them, or you're running on an older computer, you might want to go there before you even go into activating the freeze tracks. So optimizing for lower CPU usage works really well. I mean, you have a drop, but still it's demanding because in my view, it's probably one of the best sounding emulation of a Jupiter 8. But then I don't have a Jupiter 8 to compare to, but this sounds rich and lush and really nice. And look at the top, you've got Jupiter 8 layout and Jupiter System 8 layout. So if you switch to System 8, the layout you have on screen now, it's a bit bigger, and it represents also what you would have on the hardware System 8, the way it's laid out. So you would actually go physically around the same space or location on the synthesizer to be able to use it. So it's not a bad thing. It doesn't represent the original, but then if you have a System 8, it's probably more logical to use it this way. Let's just change it to the one it was. And I want to go through basically to the same. If you compare it to the Jupiter 8, the one we just looked at, the original, you have basically the same thing. You have a little bit more control here because they tell you you can control from manual to envelope 2, minus or plus, envelope 1, minus or plus, so inverse or normal polarity. And you have a wider range. So you go from 64 to 2 instead of 16 to 2. So it's very, they gave you more range. Same thing with the VCO2, but basically, and then on top of that, you also have the low frequency. So it also can go into like the LFO shape. So a wider range, which is pretty cool, you know. And the waveform, you have separately a square and a pulse width modulation. These are kind of separate controls. Where I think the original you don't have that. The level control is a little bit different, cutoff and all that stuff. So there's a little bit of a difference between some of them. And also what you have is a plus or minus, which is not something you add on the original. So a little bit more control, a little bit more power than the original. So they went a little bit. They're not copying exactly what the original did, but it means that when you look at the knob here, the fader, and you go back to the original and go, well, they might not be physically at the same space, same place, because on the original it might go from 0 to 10, and in here it goes from minus to 0 to plus. So there's a different visual reference where it should be. So some of the, if you just look at another one and then recreate it, you might not have the sound at all. And then you've got the arpeggiator, which is cool. If you need one, it's in there. But it's not in this, it's in the synth, so it's not in your sequence. Not so bad, but okay. If you look at the Jupiter from Arturia, you've got extra stuff. You've got a sequencer, you've got control about the keyboard, you've got effects you can add, and there's different LFOs, and so a much more powerful extra stuff you have here. And this is available for every virtual synth from Arturia. So it's not specific to this, it's just something to add on top of it. The way to look through your bank is really powerful, but let's not go into that for now. If you look at the synthesis itself, you have the LFO1, VCO. The VCO1 is basically same thing as the original, from 16 to 2. There's a different type of way of playing with the range here of the VCO2, meaning they basically have a much more control because they go from 16, but these are all semitones, so you can play between semitones for everything. And they show you that 8 is the original sound, and then if you go 16, you're going an octave lower. So a little bit more control than the original, but then not as wide as the new one. Well, the Roland one, the Plugout. And the rest of it basically looks like the original. And again, these works like from 0 to 10. Well, in this case, they go from 0 to 1000, but you know, from no value to maximum. So it is closer to the original look of the Jupiter than the Roland one. But the Roland, because they just gave you down and up, not just up. In this case, they just follow the original. So, but still, if you ever work with the Jupiter 8 and you want to work with this, the two of them really have most of the feel of the original because it looks and reacts the same way. But again, on the screen, these are really small knobs to turn. And I understand when people say this is kind of awkward. It's cool looking, but it's not optimized to play Well, of course, you're going to match it to whatever knobs you can, and then you're going to tweak it if you can on a controller, but it's not super nice to play with a mouse because it's, I don't know, might be just me. I don't think it is. But if you look at the third one, this one looks really cool. It doesn't look the same at all. You get VCO1, you get the cross modulation, you get the range from 16 to 2, same thing. Here, VCO2, you go -12 to +24, which is the same logic, because 0 means it's 8, -12 is 16, 4 it's +12, and 2 is +24. So you get the same thing, but it gives you a different graphic for it. You get sync, you get normal or low frequency, same logic, and you've got the control over the waveform and the waveform. So you basically have the same thing. VCO1, VCO2, the volumes, you've got the frequency here for the filter, you got the resonance, you've got -12, -24, everything is there, but in a much more optimized visual package for a plugin. So that's why I'm saying it's you get the same thing in a different package. Now, you might have a little bit less control over send and receive and modulation matrix, the envelope where they're being sent to. But still, you got envelope 1 and 2 could be sent to the VCF. You can send the envelope to VCO1 or VCO2. So you could actually change the pitch of the VCO that is being synced or the VCO that is being cross-modulated. So that where you get these rich evolution of sound. So it gives you the control into the VCO modulator there. It's just the layout's different, but honestly, if you never use the Jupiter 8, you learn this, you get mostly the same experience in the sound and the richness of the sound. And if you don't believe me, okay, let's listen to that. I'm going to play the first part, this one here. It's only going to be the Jupiter 8 version Plugout. So the circuit base, the analog circuit behavior, the ACB, analog circuit behavior. So you get this. Now I'm making too much stuff at the same time. I'm recording my camera, I'm recording the video, and I'm playing all these CPUs at the same time. It doesn't like it. I'm gonna go here, I'm gonna go freeze these tracks. Freeze it. Interesting fact, I did freeze the Jupiter 8 Plugout, and I did freeze the Arturia plugin. The 4 tracks of them, I went from 75% of CPU to 15. Now I'm just running freeze version, so playback of audio file, plus the 2 Zenology. So it means the 2 Zenology don't just take 17% of the CPU. So they're really not demanding. And that's where Zenology really shines. So let's actually go back to this screen here and play the first one. Now let's switch to the Arturia. I was not able to make exactly the same sounds because the values are not exactly, and I think that the algorithm means that they don't make exactly the same sound. Wait a second. This one. Well, that is the Plugout version, the circuit behavior version. Arturia, a bit different, not bad, different. Zenology. So that's the Zenology. Let's switch right away to the first one, the Roland Plugout. They don't react the same way. Like the envelope's not reacting the same way. And these are the preset, I never touched them. These are the preset that comes with it. These are presets from Roland to create the classic original sound that was in the Jupiter. So we have this one, go back here. Okay, let's go back to so the lead sync sound. That one is from the Plugout version. Now the Arturia. There's a little bit of effects on it, but I did tweak it to get as close as I could from the original, from the one from the Roland. So that's the Plugout. Let's switch to Zenology. Not exactly the same again. This one is more, the glide is nicer. Then again, you could tweak it. But if you compare the CPU, that's where this shines. Let's actually go back and have everything. Zenology. That's a Plugout. So as you see, there's these three options. Of course, if you can have the hardware, go for it. If you have the original, hey, be happy. But for everybody else who doesn't have the original nor the money to buy hardware, these plugins are really a good way to get the sound of the Jupiter 8. Now the Roland Arturia becomes a personal choice of sound and maybe a package. If you're into the other sound of the Roland family, then the Roland Cloud may be a better option. If you like the package of Arturia, when you can have all these synthesizers that are also from other company than Roland, then maybe the Arturia is the right package for you. For me, Zenology is really the cool approach for an interface that is not like the original, but gives you all the power of the original, or mostly all of it. The cool part of it is the fact that it doesn't require a lot of CPU, so you can run a lot of things. And again, if you're not in solo mode, where you only hear one synth, if you're in a mix mode where you have many synths playing at the same time, you don't need the detailed version of the other plugins. Zenology will do the job. It is good sounding, but it's so efficient in CPU power that it's great. And I think, honestly, Roland has to put it on the iPad. We have to collectively ask Roland, put Zenology on the iPad. We need it. It's going to be a game changer. It's going to be killer. It sounds awesome. The iPad will be able to run it. It's going to be amazing. And the package of ZenBeats with Zenology is going to be a no-brainer, So hopefully they will listen and they will do it. I really ask it. That's, for me, it's just they have to do it. So I hope they will. And until that time, I say to you, be safe and make more music. Cheers, guys. J8, it was so now can I record the two of them at the same time? Can I record another window? I can do this at the same time. This is really cool. Roland, it's the part you never see in the video when I actually try to. The part that I wait. I don't show you that part, but I do wait often when you do a video. Yes. Okay, let's try this.